The Fourth Way Up. Chapter 2. Consciousness. Consciousness can be defined as a primordial property of matter and a mode of existence of knowledge matter that distinguishes itself from other forms of matter. Since, according to Gurdjieff's teaching, knowledge is material, we can say that consciousness is also material. However, the degree of materiality is quite important in the sense of the interaction of the consciousness matter. The range of perception, speed, and volume of information processed determines the level of development of consciousness. Only forms of consciousness close in the level of development can consciously interact with each other. Accordingly, each level of consciousness knows some limited number of kinds or forms of consciousness. One of four ways of responding arises if a person encounters new, different forms of consciousness, unconsciously ignoring incomprehensible phenomena. Explanations of a new phenomenon with something understandable or pseudo-understandable, or with words behind which there is no reality. Loss of stability of consciousness, the occurrence of hysteria or psychosis, the onset of shock and loss of consciousness. According to the teachings of the Fourth Way, there is no understanding of evaluating the levels and quality of development of people's consciousness in human society. Most assessments are built on myths and opinions. On this occasion, Gurdjieff pointed out that human consciousness is underdeveloped and mosaic. That is, it has no integrity. However, it can be developed. According to the teachings of the Fourth Way, there are four states of consciousness: sleep, waking state of consciousness, self-consciousness, and objective consciousness. Sleep and the waking state of consciousness differ only in the level of communication of the centers of the psyche, in the interaction of which consciousness is formed. Self-awareness is characterized by the integrity of consciousness. Apart from wholeness, objective consciousness has the quality of existing independently of the human organism. Consciousness can be thought of as programs of self-identification in the various centers of a person's psyche. There is a large plurality of such programs. The general I am self-identification program is completely passive. Human beings are not usually aware of their plurality, but this mosaic consciousness can easily be experimentally proven. Self-remembering. The centerpiece of Fourth Way practice is working on self-remembering. It is not a memory of self or past states. It is a constant attempt to be in the here and now. The difficulty in understanding this point comes from the fact that people have largely lost a major element of their consciousness, the awareness of their presence in life. This seemingly absurd thesis is easily proven through the process of practicing self-remembering. It only seems to man that he remembers himself constantly and is always present in his life. Man was only present continuously in his life during a certain period of his childhood. There is no better proof of that than childhood. No one can argue with the fact that life as a child and self-awareness during this period were much more vivid and intense than as an adult. Time flowed slowly. The day was very long. As we passed by seemingly insignificant things, we noted a host of features in them. Our mind was open, and our perception picked up anything and everything. Now, as adults, we are sliding past the reality we live in. Our presence in life is only marked by those emotional moments when we are hurt, worried, and knocked out of our routine. In this sense, living in our troubled times is a beautiful moment that awakens consciousness. The constant uncertainty about your life, work, and the difficulties and challenges that fill this time can be sources of awakening consciousness. The intensity of work in Fourth Way groups today is quite different from what happened in similar groups 10, 20, or 30 years ago. Conscious jolts awaken people's consciousness. People are taking relatively more initiative and responsibility for their lives. Self-remembering is a method that helps a person become significantly more conscious and proactive than normal. Let's try to describe how the moment of self-remembering arises and develops. The first and simplest thing you can do is be aware of your presence in this space and time without losing yourself or identifying with emotions, things to do, or surroundings. One can compare it to a person's sense of self when he appears in a completely unfamiliar place and asks himself with astonishment, "How is it that I am here? Am I here?" He looks around in amazement and experiences a long-forgotten sense of detached presence. Some people find it incomprehensible and unpleasant. They feel disconnected from something familiar. It is very similar to the feeling of surprise. So, one should be amazed and realize he is present here and now. Another technique to improve self-memories is to enhance spatial perception. Looking up, followed by looking down, is enough to begin perceiving the surrounding space more three-dimensionally. Of course, you can't do without a certain amount of practice. It is also helpful to stop the internal dialogue when doing so. Stopping internal speech happens better by simultaneously relaxing the physical tongue in the mouth. Here is an example of a self-recollection from one of the students in the fourth way group. I stood at the end of the subway hall and looked along the hall. I was expecting friends. My mood and well-being were elevated. I felt a nagging sensation in my forearm. It was an alarm clock, a bracelet that reminded me of the need for self-remembering. I looked up at the hall's ceiling. It was decorated with gilded stucco patterns. I slowly lowered my gaze downward. The volume of the hall seemed to increase. The air in the hall suddenly turned golden. The rapture of life overwhelmed me. I stood there and reveled in the magic of what was happening. Before me was the hall of a magical palace from a children's fairy tale. My ecstasy of experiencing life was so beautiful that I was ready to shout, "Remember yourself. It is so beautiful." Actually, the subway is a convenient place for self-remembering. Here's another example of self-remembering. On the subway. I was sitting on a seat in a train car. I wanted to know what team it was and looked at the wrist of my left hand. The watch wasn't there. It was on my right arm. Immediately, I started trying to be in the here and now. That is, to remember myself. The lighting in the railroad car seemed to brighten. There was a sense of volume. I looked at the faces of the people sitting across from me. I saw that these people were asleep, despite their eyes being open. On their faces, it seemed one could even read some dreams. What struck me most was observing the people talking among themselves. To my amazement, they were also asleep. I've observed people talking to each other in their sleep. With even deeper self-remembering, you can see some constant component of the character of the people you observe. For example, I was surprised to notice that the elderly man and woman sitting in the carriage opposite me, apparently his wife, were like two dogs, a big old dog and a little room dog, which I thought reflected their relationship with each other. To continue experimenting with self-awareness, promise yourself that you will be constantly present in the here and now, starting now. Chances are, you will remember your promise after quite some time, and you won't have any continuous self-remembering. This should not come as a surprise, as our whole life is geared towards a pleasant existence in sleep. What is meant here is not a night's sleep, but a life without self-remembering self-consciousness. It is not for nothing that the Sufi poet Omar Khayyam ends one of his rubaiyat with the words, "And with a handful of the earth, I will end the dream of life." Our life is consciousness. Self-remembering as a form of consciousness has different degrees of manifestation. Deeper self-remembering is characterized by the separation of the self from identification with the functions of the centers of the psyche. In this case, the person feels like someone who is watching and controlling the centers. It feels like a detachment of self from the body. The man is surprised to feel that he is not a body. This practice will result in the realization of the self as spirit in the body. In doing so, any fear of death disappears from the person. He realizes, I am life, and the body is my biomachine, a biocomputer given to me for a time. Moreover, such a practitioner can travel outside the body at certain moments. And according to available observations, such a journey is not a fantasy or a dream. The function opposite to self-remembering in the human psyche is identification. One is constantly involved in one or another perception, activity, or emotion, especially an emotion, forgetting to keep track of oneself. In this case, self-remembering is the very mechanism that takes a person out of all kinds of identification, imagination, negative emotions, and zombification, allowing them to stop, look around, and ask themselves, what am I doing here, and why? Overcoming one's catastrophic inability to remember oneself in the here and now takes long and serious work. As with any business, there are subtleties. We need to know what our ability to awaken depends on. Ultimately, our state of consciousness is determined by the quantity and quality of the energy our body produces. Much of the work in the fourth way is to address the energy leaks that we have, unfortunately, all the time. Energy leaks out primarily through negative emotions, imagination based on them, useless conversations, and useless physical exertion. Another hole through which energy escapes in the human psyche is dreaming and daydreaming, which is the opposite of creative thinking. They have no purpose and lead to nothing but a pleasant tickle. Another leak is habits. We habitually swing our legs, make 1,000 unnecessary movements, habitually get irritated, habitually watch TV, spending a lot of time on this useless activity. We habitually talk about things as far away from us as the stars. As a result of all this equally tumultuous and futile activity, we lose much of our mental energy and are incapable of the higher manifestations of our consciousness. Creativity in this world is an exception rather than the rule. Modern psychology does not distinguish between different levels of human wakefulness. This is not accidental, since this psychology was created by people with a low level of self-awareness who could not monitor either their own or other people's states of consciousness. Therefore, conventional psychology is of little use in the fourth way. Mediocrity is the basic law of our lives. Universal mechanization and robotization have filled our lives. Gurdjieff said, "Man can always do without necessary things, but never without unnecessary things." Social consciousness, which integrates the individual levels of consciousness of each of us, has its mechanisms for imitating and maintaining mediocrity, such as alcohol, tobacco, drugs, the internet, computer games, television, and reading, which includes newspapers, magazines, and books. But nowadays, already young people do not read books, newspapers, or magazines. It's all in the phones now. They only see and hear something, but are completely unaware that they are in their deepest sleep. The process of forming idiots out of us is completed by a huge number of videos, fairy tales of our time. To break free from this chaos, grayness, and idiocy requires a constant struggle for one's higher levels of consciousness. All of this is well and clearly understood when making attempts to cultivate one's new self-awareness. Impressions are food for the human biocomputer, and by consciously choosing specific experiences, we contribute to the growth of our consciousness. Impressions are, first and foremost, the people we deal with and socialize with. There's a rule of thumb, the 15-minute rule. You can safely leave if you watch a movie for 15 minutes and don't like it. It is going to be the same from here on out. This is also the case with people. You are interacting with a person, and you are in this or that situation. Either you will make a lot of money, or it will be talk for nothing. Or you spread your wings and fly. Or you'll want to throw yourself out the window, out of desperation. In any of these cases, one can note the following rule. Communication will lead either to an increase in the level of consciousness or to its fall. And this will continue to be the case with this person. You have to make choices all the time. If your choices are in favor of experiences that lead to an increase in your level of consciousness, you're on the right track. You need to be a good observer of yourself to see where a particular moment of communication has led. If you've never smoked and you suddenly feel the urge to smoke, tobacco lowers your consciousness. Whether you like it or not, it is the result of an interaction with another person. If, after some conversation with some subject, it turns out that you began to do something wrong or out of order, it is also a sign of lowering the level of consciousness. All sorts of informational, subconscious programming, such as spoiling, jinxing, charms, and the like, also clearly reduces the level of human consciousness. You could say it's even a diagnostic sign. Unfortunately, the new low level of consciousness usually does not allow us to see our manifestation. Only through the group can a person see his manifestation. The group is a mirror to the individual. Only through the group can a person see what kind of story they are in. The fourth way teaches us to always choose to be more conscious. If reading this book has caused you an inner response, a resonance, you still have that mechanism alive, which is your salvation from the grayness and limitations of the world in which we live. It is difficult and almost impossible to develop consciousness on your own. Teaching self-remembering in a group is incomparably more effective. Consciousness work should occur in a group of people as interested as you are in developing consciousness. Depending on each person's personality, results come faster or slower, but they will surely come. As a rule, students who are modest and constant in their efforts are more successful. I remember there was a student in one of the groups who practiced self-remembering with extraordinary enthusiasm. He walked around with his eyes bulging and headphones in his ears, through which a player announced every 5 minutes the need to remember oneself. His wife sadly remarked, "He's always like that. His interest flares quickly and fades quickly." She was right. Within a month, this student had forgotten about the self-remembering. Usually, some members of the group who are good at self-remembering teach the newcomer through induction. So if self-remembering, the state of self-remembering, is transferred from the adept to the student trying to remember himself. Such a phenomenon is well known in the monasteries of Tibet and is called direct transmission. Self-remembering is an interesting endeavor. After a long time of trying to wake up, suddenly, almost unexpectedly, at some point, you wake up, and it is at that moment that you really feel that you are living, that before all life was a dream, and you feel unimaginable bliss of life at the same time. You realize that you are awake and will soon go back to sleep. This moment makes a person realize what self-remembering is, and they begin to seek a new encounter with this moment. However, a sufficient amount of time must elapse for the flash of divine perception of life to occur again. Such moments of enlightenment will occur more often and have a greater depth and duration, opening new amazing horizons of your consciousness. Your perception of life and your feeling of life will become more complete and joyful, and you will hardly want to return to the grayness of living the life that you had. If you continue your work further, the continuity of your consciousness and your awareness of yourself will extend to night sleep. For example, one student describes such a dream. I dreamed of writing something very important on the blackboard and then stepped away. At this time, my comrade came over and erased what I had written. I almost flamed with rage, but then I remembered that would be a manifestation of a negative emotion. In that instant, I turned the resulting anger into laughter. I laughed and said, "What a fast guy you are." Of course, such a dream is a manifestation of a developed consciousness. There will come a time when you too will be asleep and aware of the dream you see, intervening or not as needed. In doing so, you can think about the things that interest you, all without sacrificing any rest for your body and mind. This way, you will approach an important stage in the fourth way: self-awareness. Super efforts. Of course, not everything is as smooth as described here. At some point, you will see your multiplicity. Clearly, this will not happen on its own, but will result from self-observation, the centerpiece of which is self-remembering. It will be an agonizing moment when you will see with all certainty that one eye makes decisions, and the realization is handled by quite other eyes, completely not sharing the opinion of the first and therefore doing things their way. Different groups of eyes will constantly resist all your attempts and endeavors, and you will reach a moment of despair, realizing that you are not the master in this body. However, this happens when the selfish interests of the false personality and the self-developmental aspirations of the essence collide. This is the ultimate painful moment. When will there be a limit to patience? You scream in rage. Enough. I am now the one who is interested in working on myself and self-development, and all other selves will subside, broken by such a violent outburst of emotion. This will be the beginning of your inner crystallization into one whole self. Then finally, there will be a master in this chaos of many eyes. Such a moment of super effort is an examination. With it begins the crystallization of the astral body and the continued growth of the essence. Super effort is the extreme exertion of all mental forces to achieve an inner consolidation of all eyes with some single intention. Proper crystallization is aimed at self-development. All other aspirations lead to false crystallization. Gurdjieff always emphasized the importance of super effort in working on oneself. Only super effort is taken into account, he said. In the fourth path, the teacher must create all kinds of obstacles for the student to make a super effort and grow. The student should be conscious of obstacles of this nature, using them for self-improvement of themselves. Similar practices exist in other schools. Christian ascetics, overcoming numerous sufferings, became saints. Moreover, they deliberately went about creating suffering. The Ladder of Divine Ascent, that marvelous book of esoteric Christians, describes situations where people, despite their severe sufferings, went towards them, forcing themselves to overcome them. Be sure to read this book. You will find a lot of things that are not just useful, but also exciting. The fourth way integrates the knowledge of both esoteric Christians and esoteric Muslims, as well as Raja Yogis, and so on. The disciples of Don Juan and other men of knowledge have forged their integrity in the struggle against petty tyrants. The main difference between the fourth way and other paths of development is the constant non-identification and self-remembering. In this struggle, looking ahead, it can be said that self-remembering changes the structure of energy assimilation by the human body. Impressions, the food of our computer, create the energy that is missing now, but was so beautiful in childhood, in the emotional center. It is what is perceived as the joy of life. On the other hand, the moment of self-remembering gives the strongest impetus to further assimilate the energy of the air, which is transformed into the energy of the higher emotional center. It controls phenomena such as clairvoyance, telepathy, and intuition. In a sense, this center is a lookout in the human body. He warns against danger and guides a person to achieve his goals. We can trace the action of this center in so-called prophetic dreams. The quantity and quality of such dreams in the process of self-remembering increases. One can develop the depth of self-remembering by stopping the internal dialogue at the moment of self-remembering. Of course, stopping the inner dialogue takes long and hard practice. It can be assumed that at the moment of self-remembering, there is a harmonious alignment of the activity of the right and left hemispheres of the brain. In this case, the activity of the right and left hemispheres shifts to the area of the frontal lobes and chiasma, the crossroads of the optic nerves, which in ancient India was symbolized by a two-petaled lotus, Ajna chakra. The quality of self-remembering usually declines in proportion to a person's age unless they work on themselves. It's very easy to teach children to remember themselves. It's harder to do this with seniors. The fourth way has special techniques to increase energy production and help self-remembering for people of different ages. These techniques cannot be described in a book, as learning them is strictly individualized. The relationship of self-remembering to mental health prevention is written about in the chapter on the wrong work of centers. Alarm clocks. The fourth way utilizes ingenious psychological devices, alarm clocks, to keep one's urge for self-remembering alive. Alarm clocks are mechanical devices that have no purpose other than to remind us to remember ourselves here and now, and that change as we get used to them. It is kind of like an ancient memory knot. The person tying the knot as a keepsake had to remember what the knot was tied for. Our knots, our alarm clocks, remind us to be in the here and now, that is, to remember ourselves. This device is usually an inconvenience of one sort or another. Pleasant alarm clocks are a rare exception. Examples of alarm clocks. Today, we put a watch on our right wrist and a piece of plastic in our shoe. Tomorrow, we will put thorns in our clothes, wear a tight bracelet on our arm, and so on. Fourth way group members invent and share such alarm clocks all the time. Students who begin using alarm clocks rebel against them quite often. It is the I, not interested in the self-development of the group, that resists the work. Students find a plethora of excuses directed against alarm clocks. For example, they say they remember themselves better without alarm clocks, or even that such devices are annoying and interfere with self-remembering. As a rule, such statements can be heard from people superficially interested in working on themselves. If one is honestly and sincerely working on himself, however, he will certainly realize the value of alarm clocks. The rejection of alarm clocks, even in advanced adepts, indicates a deviation from the fundamental line of development. A person who has attained self-awareness, that is, person number 5, does not need a reminder of awakening. In addition to alarm clocks, there are many different methods of waking up. These include the collection of alms by monks of different denominations, Christian fasting, and the conscious humiliation of self practiced in many spiritual traditions. I will add that an interesting indicator was that Generalissimo Suvorov was doing something amazing. He would jump up on a stool in the presence of his subordinates and suddenly start cuckooing. Everyone thought it was his kind of wacky stuff. It appears he was practicing esoteric Christianity, deliberately putting himself in the position of a crank, if not a fool. It is both conscious prayer and working to overcome your habits. In some ways, it is similar to the non-doing described in the works of Carlos Castaneda. There are many examples of such non-doing. You can do work with your left hand, put on clothes in the opposite order to what you put them on and drive and walk on unfamiliar routes. In short, it destroys the whole mass of habits created in us by sleeping people in a sleeping society.